Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started on this. So in just a moment here, I've never done these before, so we're going to see if it shows up on the YouTube channel like I think it should. And then I'll send out a quick remind. Okay. All right, that's cool. Okay, so it looks like I am getting it up on YouTube right now, so that's cool. The problem, unfortunately, is that it is playing back to me in my headphones right now, so I've got to mute it over there on YouTube so that I can see what's going on. So, I have questions coming in already. Okay. So I'm just going to ignore the weird me that is like 30 seconds delayed from the actual video of me over here, and go over a little bit about how we're going to run this. I'm sorry it's not through the same system that we used last time. It's actually a little bit easier for you guys to use, I think, because I don't have to invite you in order for you to ask questions. Instead, what I'd like you guys to do is to either tweet at me, because I've got my tablet right here. So I'll be watching tweets come in, that sort of stuff. You can use the hashtag #AskMsGalloway, or just tweet directly at me at Galloway Teaches. Otherwise, you can put your questions in the in the chat log, which I'm seeing right here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do these in order as they pop up. So I'm going to start with Joanne's question here about the electoral system in the UK. All right, so the electoral system in the UK is a single member districting system on a national level, okay, wherein you have the overall population of the UK divided into constituencies, where you've got different areas of the country divided up on a basis of the goal is about 68,000 people per constituency. Now, as we know, dividing up voting districts is really complicated and often extremely politicized, so that can be a problem. So these constituencies are drawn often by the party that happens to be in power at the time, which means they tend to favor the status quo. Whoever is in power tries to make sure that they draw safe districts. So each one of those districts gets one member of parliament. There are 650 members of parliament total in the House of Commons. House of Lords is a separate issue. We'll deal with that in a moment. So when there is a national election, which occurs at least every 5 years, although not every 5 years because it's called for by the Prime Minister. Remember, they don't have like constitutional amendments saying that you must vote on this particular day. That's not how it works for them. They're simply restricted in that they must hold a national election at least every 5 years. So on the day of national elections, you go to your polling place within your constituency to cast your ballot. What you have are the options of voting for various members of parliament who would represent your district, one from each of the major parties. Now, the two major party systems, of course, within the UK are Conservatives and Labour, but there are and have been more minor parties developed since about the 1970s. So there's also the Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, you've got Sinn Féin, if you're over in Northern Ireland, you've also got the Liberal Democrats and the Ulster Unionist and the Democratic Unionist and a whole bunch of others. Green Party is also a party, that sort of stuff. But really the big three are going to be Conservatives, Labour, and then with a very small minority, Lib Dems. Now, those three major parties, basically, they're really vying for control of the House of Commons on a yearly basis, on a national election basis. When the election is held, whoever receives the most votes in a constituency wins that seat. That is a single-member district system that is using plurality as the method of vote counting. So when we say plurality, remember we're talking about people being elected on the basis of whoever wins the most votes, not whoever wins 50% plus one, which is versus a majority, okay? So what you can wind up with is, because if you have like 5 major parties running for power within one particular constituency, it's entirely possible that someone could win the electoral seat within that particular constituency with a mere like 33% of the vote. So what this means is that the electoral system in Britain tends to exaggerate the scale of the victory of whatever party happens to be in power, because it isn't proportional. It's not a proportional system. Now, there are virtues to it not being proportional, okay? In a proportional system, parties have a whole lot more power and authority than individual members of parliament do. Now, in the UK, they do still have a lot of power and authority as a party. There's very strong party discipline, but there's also the possibility of a little bit more individual variance there. So Joanne, I hope that helps you answer the question there. If not, please let me know and I'll follow it up, okay? So I'm going to move on to Keisha's question here on libertarianism. Remember, as you join in, guys, feel free to type your questions into the chat that's on the right-hand side of your page. I can see it and I'll be answering it. And just so you know, I think I'm on about a 30-second delay from you guys. So if you type something in, I'm probably not going to see it for about 30 seconds. So just be aware of that. So hang on a second here. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Sorry, guys. Coffee going down the wrong chute is not a good thing. All right. Better now. Sorry. Okay. So Keisha asks, what is libertarianism? Hopefully you guys can see the questions too, but just in case you can't, if you're watching on the class website, I'll read the questions as well. So Keisha wants to know what libertarianism is. Okay, so libertarianism really pertains more to, say, the United States and our political system right now. In a lot of ways, libertarianism is an expression of an extremely liberal political ideology. Now, remember, when we talk about liberal political ideologies, we're not talking about leftist political ideologies. That's not exactly what we're doing here. Liberal means that we have, when we're talking about political ideologies, not within current sort of discourse about politics, but liberalism as a concept basically places a premium on individual freedom. If politics is sort of the negotiation between the balance of equality versus freedom, like we talked about last unit, then liberalism makes the argument that the most important thing for any government is always going to be individual freedom. All right, so when in doubt, err on the side of individual freedom. That means very limited government control. That means you should have a weak state capacity and you should have weak state autonomy. The state should be really responsive to the individuals within the population. So libertarianism kind of takes that central idea and runs with it. So libertarianism as a political ideology within the United States basically makes the argument that there should be very, very, very limited government control, especially at the federal level. That the powers of the federal government should really be limited to defense and whatever taxation is necessary for that national defense. Everything else should be left alone and run through private enterprise and private concerns. So there's this idea of really getting the state out of everything. And in terms of what that means in terms of public policy here in the US, libertarianism tends to be small government, low taxes, but also tends to make arguments that the government shouldn't be involved in social issues such as gay marriage or abortion, because that would be government intrusion on individual freedoms. Also, legalization of drugs, that sort of stuff. So that's where liberalism comes in. I listed under, I believe, the political ideology section of your study guide, which, if you haven't downloaded, it is available on the class website. It's also in your email. So please do check that. But I listed under political ideologies, particularly in the context of anarchism, because there are some similar ideas, especially with the idea of self-determination, emphasis on individual freedoms. So I hope that helps, Keisha. All right. Sarah Baker wants to know, Can I explain the different views of political parties in the UK involving immigration, the healthcare system, and political goals? I certainly can. The better question is, can you guys? But I'll help you out here. Okay. All right. So when we're talking about political parties in the UK, the big ones you really need to focus on for the purpose of the AP exam and really for this upcoming test is going to be the Conservatives, Labour Party, Lib Dems, okay, Liberal Democrats. It's important for you to know the Scottish National Party as well because they are fairly large and really they're taking a lot of voters from the Labour. But really in terms of platform, the Scottish National Party is very similar in a lot of their goals to Labour, and they in fact tend to kind of vote with Labour on a regular basis. So let's start at the top. Okay, the Conservatives are the largest party and therefore the party of the Prime Minister, Theresa May. The Conservatives are more left of center than American conservative parties are, but they are still conservative, emphasizing the status quo over major change, over kind of the idea of progressive change than in comparison to like Labor. Labor's way far left of anything we've got here in the US. So Conservative Party platform with regards to, let's see, you want immigration, healthcare, and political goals. Okay. On a broad level, their political goals are to kind of continue a lot of the policies and ideals set forth by Margaret Thatcher during the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Now, these are largely neoliberal economic policies that value free trade, limited government intervention in private affairs, particularly private business affairs. So we have an emphasis on privatization over nationalization in terms of businesses. So the UK government pulled out of their investment in things like, say, Rolls-Royce or Jaguar or the British Airways that got pulled out of as well. So in terms of economics, that's kind of their goal. Additionally, in terms of social policies, generally speaking, they tend to be a little bit more status quo and a little bit less willing to adopt or at least push issues like gay marriage. Gay marriage is, of course, legal in the UK and has been for longer than it has been in the United States, but the Conservatives were not the vanguard on that particular thing. That was not a critical issue for them. In terms of the National Health Service, which is, I believe, what you're referring to with the healthcare system, it's the NHS. The Conservatives do not advocate for the abolition of the NHS. That would be political suicide in the UK. There are lots of people who advocate for significant fiscal reform of the NHS, cutting a lot of what they deem unnecessary expenditure to it, shrinking the size. But the idea that the NHS is kind of a cornerstone of British identity is something that the Conservatives do not fight. They too support the idea that the NHS is something that all Britons have a right to, so they wouldn't argue against it. In terms of immigration, the Conservatives do want to see a significant limitation to the amount of immigrants coming into the UK, particularly as a result of the refugee crisis starting in 2015. They take a pretty hard line, especially against the immigrants waiting on the coast of France and Calais. They really only want to admit minors if they're seeking asylum. Other than that, they're really not too keen on immigration. In fact, that's one of the reasons why some members of the Conservative Party were Brexiteers, were supporters of the idea of Brexit. Okay, although remember that wasn't official party policy. Official party policy is nope, stay in the EU. Let's see here. What else have we got? Okay, we've got Tiara. Tiara wants me to explain the key points of all the Harkness readings. All of them? All of them? Like, I'm not going to go over every single reading, guys. Can you give me specific questions? I would think in terms of ones that you really need to focus on, Fareed Zakaria's A Liberal Democracy, you need to know that backwards, forwards, and inside out. If you have a specific question about that, I'd be more than happy to help you out with it. But I'm not going to just kind of sit here and recount all all 6 of the articles. Give me a specific question and I'll get into it with greater detail, okay? So Tiara, if you're still watching, think about what it is that you need to know from each article, and I'd be more than happy to help you out there. But I'm not going to sit down and recount from the top, okay? Yeah, I just can't do that for you, okay? Let's see here. Neelan wants me to explain and describe religious tension in the UK. Good question. Hang on a second. Coffee. Okay. All right. So Neelan says, can I explain and describe the religious tension in the UK? All right. So the big divisions in terms of UK society with regards to religion are primarily Catholic versus Protestant, primarily in Northern Ireland. That is it sounds so 15th century to say that that's their big issue, but it really is, especially in Northern Ireland, where Catholicism and Protestantism isn't just a matter of religion, it's also a matter of national identity. And so it really kind of exacerbates the political and social tensions and economic tensions that exist in Northern Ireland. Historically speaking, it was allowed and encouraged to discriminate against Catholics in terms of educational admittance, in terms of job hirings, that sort of stuff. So that meant that Irish people had a lower likelihood of having a decent job for much of the 19th and early 20th century. And of course, what that does is it creates divisions within class. It exacerbates poverty problems. So as a result of this, when we're talking about religious tensions, particularly in Northern Ireland, but also present in Great Britain as a whole, when we talk about the divisions between Catholics and Protestants, we are also talking about an economic and education gap. And that's something to consider. It shows up in policy. A lot of Irish Catholics or Northern Irish Catholics in the Northern Ireland Assembly, a lot of their policies tend to be more leftist, more focused on equality issues, the idea of bringing in, greater degree of economic equality for people in Northern Ireland, particularly Catholics. Because systematically they'd been kind of excluded for several hundred years, which is considerable. We can also think about just tensions within the UK are rising tensions between Muslim and non-Muslim communities in London, not London, excuse me, all of the UK since 2005. UK, as we noted in class, has a really, really, really small minority population overall. When we're talking 87% white, and we're talking more than 50% of the population actively identifying as Christian, but then another quarter saying that they have no religious affiliation. The fact that you have a minority religious population like Muslims can be rather hard to integrate, and there's been kind of a reluctance to fully work on considering Muslim Britons to have the same sort of political considerations and to have the same sort of importance in British political life as everybody else. So there's that. Although I believe several of you noted in class that London has now elected their first Muslim mayor as of, I think, last year, 2015 elections. And that marks a significant change. But there's been a lot of anxiety about the fact that Muslim communities are kind of other in the UK, and this allows for people to be isolated, not brought fully into British society, not really brought into the political conversation, not brought into the economic conversation. And that leads to a lot of alienation and thus potentially the possibility of being radicalized. There's been some real concern about British Muslim citizens leaving the UK and going and fighting with ISIS or IS, as most frequently in the UK, they're going to call ISIS IS or Daesh. They're not going to use the phrase ISIS or ISIL. Just in the case of you guys reading for your current event, if you see that, just know that that's what it is. But there's been a lot of concern about a lack of interaction between Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities. So I hope that helps. Okay, Keisha, hi. Can I explain what constitutional court is? I can try. Okay. Constitutional courts, essentially what their job is, and they're relatively new in the UK. Let me back up. Okay, so the UK is a parliamentary system, obviously, and in it there's an emphasis on parliamentary sovereignty, meaning that whatever Parliament does is an expression of the will of the people and is therefore, in essence, constitutional. Now, as of the late 90s, early 2000s, there was growing concern about the lack of protections that result from a system based on common law, where basically Parliament and the ruling party can do whatever they like. That if you take on the sort of legal premise that the ruling party is the expression of the general will of the public, then the ruling party can do what it likes. This becomes sort of a question of the tyranny of the majority, if you remember your de Tocqueville from last unit. So this became a real concern for politicians, and it was something that people had been bandying about for a while. So constitutional courts, essentially, what they are meant to do is to review particular acts of parliamentary legislation and determine whether or not they are in keeping with the general precedent of British common law. Okay. Now, to be perfectly frank, British constitutional courts are pretty weak. They have very, very few powers in comparison to, say, like the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States is another constitutional court where they review the constitutionality of laws. But here in the US, if the judicial branch through the Supreme Court determines that a law is unconstitutional, then it is nullified. It's gone. It no longer or bearing on the legal systems from that point forward. So there's that to consider, which is particularly that's concerning potentially. Okay. All right. Keisha, let me know if that answered your question or not. Otherwise, there's a really great section in Chapter 6 that talks about that. Remember when you guys went over the different parts of democratic institutions? That's where you'll find the information. If you look in it's in your Reader 2.1, and it's in the first part of that reader. So if you have any questions about the Constitutional Court as a general concept, there's a better explanation of it there. If you want to look at it in terms of the UK, look in your Reader 2.2 under the section on the judiciary. Okay, let's see here. Kat, I'm looking to see if, no, Tara hasn't. Oh, did I skip one? I totally did. I'm sorry. Hey, let me go back. Okay. All right. Duanne asked a while ago before Keisha, and I totally skipped a question here. I'm sorry. Duanne asked a question about Golden Dawn and Mussolini. She asked, what is important to know about Golden Dawn and what is important to know about Mussolini? All right. I put both of those down as examples of fascist political ideology. Fascism is definitely one of the political ideologies that you should know. I'm telling you right now, there will definitely be a question on political ideologies, and fascism will be involved. Everybody got that? Okay, so there's definitely going to be a question on fascism. Now, fascism is a rejection of both the idea of emphasizing equality and of emphasizing freedom. Basically, fascism operates on this assumption that there are some people who are more valuable, who are better suited to rule than others. And so it's based upon this idea of it's based upon this central idea that there is a legitimate hierarchy within society, that there are some who are worthy and some who aren't. So based off of that, fascism kind of takes those who are worthy and identifies them as the true sort of seat of the nation. And that is where all decision-making power rests, is with that particular group. And if it happens to disenfranchise people who aren't part of that group, well, that's fine, because fascism operates on the assumption that there are some people who are simply better than others. Okay. Generally speaking, fascism is very authoritarian, quite top-down. There is basically no room for any democratic principle in fascism. That's kind of how that works. So fascism is not the same as an illiberal democracy. Be real clear on that. That's kind of important. But Okay, all right, Duane says forget a question. Okay, that's cool. So basically, we've got this idea here that you've got a system of government um, by which you have this sort of ranking class-based system. Benito Mussolini is really the first major political theorist to write about fascism in the 1920s. It's kind of his fault. But his ideas endure and they show up in various places today. Today, there is no active political system that embraces fascism as the cornerstone of its ideology, but of course, historically, there were. There are, however, political parties that adhere to fascist doctrine. The Golden Dawn in Greece is one of them. They are a distinctly white nationalist group, pro-Christian, very anti-Muslim, anti-refugee, anti-diversity group. They do sometimes espouse violence, but they actually also hold quite a few seats in the Greek parliament. So that's fun for everybody. Let's see here. Okay, so we've done Keisha. Let's see here. Okay, Kat, hi. All right. Kat wants to know if we can review the idea between concrete and abstract review again. Okay, so concrete and abstract review deal with different types of judicial review, okay? And judicial review is the basic idea of an independent, and this is important, independent judiciary going back and looking at laws that have been passed. Now, abstract review, let me see if I can pull this up for you guys. Sorry, give me a second. I think I've got something I can pull up for you. No, I don't know. Okay. I don't know if I can pull this up for you guys. Sorry. Okay, so I can't pull up what I want to pull up for you guys because it's pretty cool, but I can't show it to you. So if I can, I'll put it up on the blog. It's a little video that goes over it. But basically, here's how it works. In Europe, we've got this thing that we refer to as abstract review. And generally speaking, what it's looking at is kind of a holistic look at whether or not things fit in with the whole of common law. Concrete review is where you are looking at one particular law. Does this particular law adhere to the constitutionality of law as a whole? So that's the kind of thing. Let me see. Is there any better way I can explain this? I don't think I'm explaining it particularly well. Hang on a second. No? Okay. Well, let me do it. Yeah, but basically, Kat, that's what it is like abstract review tends to be a European thing. That's what they do in the UK is abstract review, and you're kind of looking at it within the body of the entirety of common law. Concrete review is like looking at one particular law, separate but equal. Okay, it's like looking at state laws that say that Black people couldn't sit in the same compartments on railway cars as whites when you got into certain states, and it's looking at one particular case. So that's my basic understanding of it. And if I'm incorrect, please call me out on it. But I think that's the general gist of it. Otherwise, I'm going to see if I can put that video up on the blog for you because it's a really good one and I can't get it. I think the problem is that I'm trying to do this while I'm on YouTube at the same time and it won't let me do it. Okay. All right, let's see here. Okay, Sarah has a follow-up question. She wants to know what the major social division in the UK is when it comes down to education. How might this change the result from Brexit? All right, so I think I understand your question, Sarah. If I'm not getting this correct, feel free to, send something to me. Any questions coming in on Twitter? Nope. Okay. All right. So Sarah wants to know major social division in the UK when it comes to education. All right, so we already talked about the major division within the UK in terms of social cleavages is always class. It's class, it's class, it's class, which perhaps makes sense when you think about for much of the UK's history, it's been essentially racially monolithic. You've been dealing with a bunch of white people with not a whole lot of divisions aside from that. I mean, and that's part of the reason why these national identities persist, I think, is because you've got a fairly monolithic racial makeup, and so the divisions between different regions becomes exaggerated as a result of that. And because of that, you also have divisions based on income and education level that also become exaggerated as a result of having not too much in the way of racial diversity up until the 1960s. So at any rate, when we're talking about education level, there is a sincere divide between the elite of the elite of the elite and then working class people. Most working class people go to what we would consider public schools. That's not the terminology they use, but they are public schools. They're funded through councils and local monies, and that makes them essentially public in our understanding. And schooling is free until you complete your senior level education courses. When you are, I think you take your A levels at 16. Is that when they take it? I think it might be. But in general, there's a big difference between that public education and what are called public schools. Public schools are so called because they encouraged people to go into public service. So like in the 1800s, if you wanted your son or your son was going to inherit a seat in the House of Lords, you would send him to a public school because he needed to be publicly educated in such a way that he could take his job in government. These are extremely, extremely expensive. They are boarding schools primarily. They have a real, they have a continued history of sort of class-based sort of elitism that goes along with it. They're extremely formal, and they're very, very competitive, and they're excellent educational institutions without a doubt. But what you wind up with is a small number of people who can have these really high level, high quality educations that have very different experiences from people who are going to what we would consider public education venues, to grammar school and secondary school and that sort of stuff. So what all of this means is that okay, so what all of this means is that we have, I've totally lost my train of thought, is that we have these divisions develop between people who have access to these systems of education and otherwise. And essentially, that's a class division sort of thing. So, Sarah, I think when you're asking what is the major social division in the UK when it comes to education, I think ultimately that's a class-based question. And how does it result in a change from Brexit? I'm not sure I understand there, but do you mean like, does that, like how might this change as a result of Brexit, or how might this change in terms of the results from Brexit? Because broadly speaking, the more education people had access to, the less likely they were to vote in favor of Brexit. People with a higher degree of education, if you had post-secondary schooling options, if you had graduated from university, if you had a post-secondary degree, people are much less likely to vote in favor of Brexit. Part of that might be because when you are working class, when you're working wage labor that isn't particularly glamorous, those are the jobs that are available to people who are newly arrived to the country, who don't have necessarily the connections or work experience to move directly into white-collar jobs. So disproportionately, people with lower education levels would be those affected by an increase in immigration. And therefore, you might see that resentment against increased immigration show up at the polls as a result of Brexit. So Sarah, I hope that answers your question. I'm not entirely sure I understood it properly, but if I didn't, please clarify in the chat and I'll let you know. All right, so that's Sarah. Selena wants me to go over political institutions in the UK and their roles. All of them. Okay, we'll do this quickly. Let me see real quick. Okay, hang on. Really quickly before I move on to another topic, Sarah says, how might this change due to Brexit occurring? Won't the working class be seen as more important now? I don't think there's any politician in the UK today who would make the argument that the working class isn't important. That would be really politically dumb to do that. But uh, I'm not entirely sure, like, why Brexit would mean that the working class would be seen as more important. Um, I'm going to ask that you either clarify or that we move on, because it's not in. I'm going to let you know it's not going to be something that I'm going to ask you a whole lot about on the test. And frankly, it can't be something that they ask you a lot about on the AP exam, because they've already written the test and they had already written it before Brexit occurred. So that is not going to be something that's a big deal on the test. So I'm going to back up and I'm going to go ahead and address let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and address Selena's questions about political institutions. So Sarah, if that doesn't help, please let me know and I'll try to clarify some more, okay? But Selena wants to know if we can go over the political institutions in the UK and their roles. So let's think about it. We've got a number of different political institutions that you guys covered for me in class when I was absent doing GHP interviews, etc. So let's start with the Constitution, which is usually a political institution in any country we're going to be talking about. But in the UK, it is a weird thing. Remember, the UK has an unwritten constitution. Hang on a moment. Let me take a drink. All right. So the UK has an unwritten constitution, which means that unlike the United States, it is not exactly a, it isn't a system by which we have a, hang on a second, something just came in via Twitter. All right, Taylor, I see you. I'll get to you in just a minute, okay? So unlike, say, the United States, where we have our Constitution written down into a body of work, where you've got the various articles and it basically states these are the principles by which we run our country, the UK doesn't work like that because it developed its Constitution over a series of centuries. And it's really kind of cobbled together from previous documents like the Magna Carta, which you better know backwards, forwards, and inside out, because I will be asking you about it. And through previous laws issued by Parliament and by decisions that have been handed down throughout the years. And this sets what we know as precedent, and that becomes the basis of common law. If things have been done in a certain way for so long, then it's presumed to be the way things should be done. This is that idea of traditional legitimacy. So the UK really uses traditional legitimacy as part of its backup for its constitution. So the constitution in the UK is a way less formal institution than it is in most other countries. It is less influential because the Constitution essentially is at the mercy of Parliament, which is another major major institution. So another major political institution in the UK is the legislative bodies, and the legislative bodies are the House of Commons and the House of Lords, collectively known as Parliament. For our purposes in this class, primarily the big thing that is important is going to be the House of Commons. House of Lords is largely an appointed body now. It had been hereditary up until the Labour government of Tony Blair. Tony Blair undertook some major revisions to the peerage. Now, peers are people who had inherited positions like barons and lords and viscounts and all sorts of different people, marquises, and I'm probably saying that incorrectly, but whatever. I don't live in Downton Abbey. So at any rate, you've got all of these people who have inherited titles throughout their family histories, and often that went with land. And because it came with land, that often meant that they were in charge of that land in Parliament. So they were in charge of that constituency. Obviously, this is potentially problematic. The House of Lords is today only partially made up of people who have inherited seats. It's a very small percentage. Most of them are what we call honorary peers, people who have been made knights or dames of the realm because of their service to the UK. So that could be military service, could be, civic obligations, that sort of stuff. Like if you ran a charity and they did really wonderful things, then the king or queen, whoever's on the throne, could knight you or make you a dame of the realm. And then you would technically get a seat in the House of Lords. And you can vote. Like Andrew Lloyd Webber is Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, and he sometimes votes in the House of Lords, but they very, very, very rarely get an active vote in terms of policy. It's primarily more like proclamations that they get to do. They have very little legislative power. Instead, the real power in the UK is in the hands of the House of Commons. Okay, the House of Commons, as we've noted before, has 650 members. Really, only 649 can vote because one is a speaker. The speaker always comes from the majority house. They're in charge of the day-to-day business of running the house. They get the gavel. Okay, they can, call on people. I strongly suggest that you go on YouTube, you look at the UK Parliament's channel, and you check out Question Time with the Prime Minister, because it's hilarious. In some classes, we did have the time to actually watch it. In some classes, we didn't. But I might put it up on the blog just because it's super fun. But the House of Commons is essentially the primary ruling body of the UK. The Prime Minister comes from the House of Commons from the largest party, and basically the party tends to vote as a bloc, which means legislation passes quickly. It passes really, really fast in parliamentary systems, particularly in the UK. There's not a lot of deliberation on this sort of stuff, and you're always assured that if it passes through the House of Commons, it's almost inevitably going to be signed into law by the Prime Minister. Another institution, the Prime Minister comes, of course, from the legislative body. Traditionally, this means that there are very few checks upon the power of the Prime Minister and the power of the ruling party. This is very different from a presidential system, obviously. However, there are certain things that can be done to limit the power of a Prime Minister, particularly by removing them from office. This is, of course, the vote of no confidence. Votes of no confidence are rare beasts. They don't happen frequently because they're dangerous. You would really only hold a vote of no confidence if you knew you had the votes. And that really means that you need the majority of the dominant party in the House of Commons to vote with you. So if you were a Labour Party politician and you felt that Theresa May had done something inexcusable and she needed to be removed from power, you would need people from the Conservative Party to side with you in order to hold an up-down straight vote on whether or not she should be removed from power. The bill would be introduced, and essentially the vote would be held the same day. The motion would be introduced, the vote would be held the same day, and it's just an up-down vote. And once it's carried out, the Prime Minister is gone, which means that Prime Ministers tend to be a little bit more reactive and subject to they're a little bit more unshielded from political consequences than, say, presidents are. A president, if something is going on badly and their party doesn't particularly like the way they're handling it, a president can't be easily removed from office. That requires impeachment and then an impeachment trial, and it is a long, drawn-out legal proceeding. A vote of no confidence can happen overnight, which means that frequently, if prime ministers feel that they might be subjected to a vote of no confidence, they resign. Or their party pressures them to resign as party leader and therefore resign as prime minister as well. So the prime minister here is a very powerful executive. They really, really are. But that connection to the legislative body or somewhat. Okay, so that's the head of government. Another political institution within the UK is, of course, the Crown. So the Crown. The Crown is really interesting in the UK. It doesn't have a lot of powers in terms of legislation, obviously, although it does have a role in the legislative branch in that it opens Parliament on a yearly basis. It has to call for the Prime Minister to form the government. But basically, ever since George III, the guy who lost the U.S., ever since George III and the Hanover transfer of power, there really has been more power in the hands of Parliament than in the Crown. So the Crown is primarily symbolic, is a representational representation of tradition. They are sort of the physical embodiment of the idea of common law, if you will, because they are this continuing tradition. And people in the UK do value that quite a lot. There's a reason why the Conservative Party keeps winning in the UK, and it's because there is an appreciation for tradition and the value of the status quo and that. And then the judiciary as another major political institution, which I think I've already talked about how weak it is. So, Selena, if I didn't answer your question previously with regards to the political institution of the judiciary in the UK, let me know and I'll help you out with that, okay? So I think I hit all the institutions there. If I didn't, let me know because I'm like, any notes in front of me. Let's see here. Okay, Nicole wants to know what the difference between an initiative and a referendum is. I can do that. So an initiative is, think of it as a petition with teeth. An initiative is a voter or an electorate triggered vote that occurs when some countries you can have the public directly vote on issues if they manage to get a certain number of signatures on the issue. So you would pass around petitions like, I don't know, let's change the flag to a giant, like, dragon rearing up on, like, a field of blue. Like let's change, like, that's what our flag is going to be now. And you could initiate a vote on that by gaining enough signatures that you would then send into the government. And if you had enough signatures on the issue, then they would be required to hold an up-down vote on that particular issue. So that's an initiative. An initiative is public driven. The public takes initiative. That's where that word comes from, okay? A referendum is different. A referendum has to be begun from the top down, from the existing government down. So basically what occurs is that you would have the prime minister or the president, depending on your governmental system, decide to let people vote directly on a particular issue. But they would have to trigger the vote, okay? So this is what David Cameron did by allowing there to be a vote held on the idea of Brexit. That is a referendum. The referendum, just like initiatives, are usually up-down votes. Whoever has the most votes wins. It is legally binding. It's not a poll. Some people keep referring to the Brexit vote as a poll. No, that's not what it is. A poll is when they call me in the middle of dinner and want to know how I'm voting. It's legally binding. Parliament can't get out of it. Okay. So I hope that helps you out there, Nicole. Let's see. Who else have we got? All right. Duane wants to know why the judicial system. Oh, hang on. Okay. You've just deleted that one. All right. So Bethel says, can we explain why many people choose to you? Can I explain why many people chose to leave the EU? Can I also explain the EU? Honey, ain't nobody can explain the EU, but I'll try. Okay. First and foremost, let's tackle the big question of what the EU is. Following the end of World War II, there was a feeling in the general global community that wars like World War I and World War II could not be allowed to occur again. One potential response to this was the United Nations, which is an intergovernmental system. Remember the difference between intergovernmental and supranational system, guys. Super important. I really do need you to clarify the difference between the two of them on the test. I will be asking about it. Okay. But because Europe had been sort of the starting point for much of the conflict of both World War I and World War II, and the devastation, and particularly the devastation of World War II, was so incredibly vast, there was this sense in Western Europe that those sorts of divisions could never be allowed to happen again. You couldn't have this hyper-nationalism, this jingoism that developed in Italy and in Germany. That just could not happen. You couldn't let tensions develop like that. There are too many people living in too close quarters in Western Europe, and it was just unsafe. So the idea was to create a European Union by which you had an emphasis on cooperation, a lot of integration of different governmental policies, an encouragement of free trade between nations in Europe. The idea being that if you do a lot of business with people, you are unlikely to shoot them, which is a fair argument. So you have this push following the end of World War II to create some sort of institution that would pull Europe closer together instead of allowing it to divide further apart. So in the 1970s, you have the germs of what are essentially going to be the European Union coming to fruition. This is going to be the European Economic Area to begin with. And in 1973, the UK held one of 3 referendums that it ever held to determine whether or not it would join this new economic area. Over time, that economic area grew to become what we understand today as the European Union. They do have regulatory power. They can pass laws that affect all member states. They have the ability to negotiate trade treaties with other sovereign nations. It's pretty powerful. The EU, if we consider it as one total economy, I mean, it is, I think it might surpass the US, or if not very close to it, in terms of its economic power. I mean, the UK is the 9th most powerful economy in the world. Germany's higher than that. France is up there too. You put all those together, it's a very, very powerful engine. So the EU forms out of this desire to kind of prevent conflict. So why would people choose to leave it? Well, because of a lot of those regulatory powers that the EU has. The EU can pass regulations which all member states must follow, which means you do have to give up your national sovereignty, that you're going to have less state autonomy than you previously did, that the will of the people in the UK might be subject to the will of the people in France and Germany and Italy and all of the other member states. And that rubbed people the wrong way. And one can understand why. It certainly is something to be concerned with. I think you also saw a rise in anti-immigration rhetoric that developed out of a concern for the feeling that Britain was changing and people didn't understand how or why, especially following the economic downturn of 2008 to 2010. Economic downturns tend to coincide. I wouldn't make the argument of causation, but there's definitely a strong correlation between the idea of economic difficulties and a rise in anti-immigration sentiment. Those two things tend historically in many countries to go hand in hand. In the sort of the end of the aughts, beginning of the 2010 period, a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric. By the war in Syria and the refugee crisis that started to develop at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, and really was driven by a lot of nativist rhetoric that was coming out of UKIP and other parties as well. So when you combine that with the real, truly legitimate concerns about loss of sovereignty that was developing within the UK, and you combine that with an entirely rational concern about economic stability, it makes people willing to make this choice. Also, you've got to remember that elections in the UK happen much, much faster than they do here in the United States. So when the referendum was called for, it didn't take as long as it did previously. A little bit, Bethel, but let me know if it doesn't, okay? I've got a question that came in from Twitter that I do want to get to. So Taylor wanted to know, hi Taylor. Taylor wanted to know, can I, oh my goodness, more people asking about the Harkness discussions here. Taylor, I'm going to suggest, do you have specific questions about specific Harkness readings? Because I'm not going to go over all 6. My suggestion would be to really look at Fareed Zakaria's Illiberal Democracy, the article on what democracy is and what it isn't in terms of characteristics. I think that one's really important for you to look at. The other big themes were devolution and the role of party politics. Devolution, the role of party politics, and also Brexit. Those are the big themes. So think about, do you have specific questions relating to those? And then we'll move on from there. Okay, so let's see here. Hi, Claire. I'm looking at Claire's question right now. Claire wants to know, what is the difference between reign versus rule and party rule? Okay, all right. So on what part of the study guide is it on? I can't remember. I don't have it in front of me right now. I could probably pull it up. Oh, parliamentary versus presidential. Okay. Okay. So I put on there as a term the idea of reign versus rule. Okay. So frequently, reign versus rule is used as an expression of the division between the job of the head of state and head of government. Okay. That especially when we're talking about parliamentary systems in a constitutional monarchy, there is an idea that we divide the jobs of the monarch, whose job it is to reign, from the job of the government, whose job it is to rule. Okay, so reigning is providing that long-term continuity of regime throughout the country and the government. Okay, whereas the job of the government per se, the head of the government and the government itself, their job is to actually enact the policies of regime and to pass legislation and deal with the daily business of ruling. Okay, so when we think about the difference between a presidential and a parliamentary system or a semi-presidential system, what you can see is that in a presidential system, there's no real difference between the idea of reign and rule, because in a presidential system, particularly because it's coming out of us, there never was a king. So there's not this idea that you have one person whose job it is to deal with like legislature and like, you know, legislative stuff and setting policy and all of that. And then another person it is to represent continuity. Like that doesn't happen in a presidential system. In a presidential system, the president is both. They are the office of the president, which is reign, and they are also the individual who is pushing for policy, and that is rule. So in a presidential system, those two things are combined. In a parliamentary system, the idea of reign versus rule is entirely separate, that you've got a king or a queen, and then you've got the prime minister, and those two things, never the two shall meet. In some places, obviously, in like Australia doesn't have a separate king or queen. They use Britons. So their monarch is still, their reign is still the queen. Okay, Elizabeth II is still their head of state. And then you have semi-presidential systems, like say France, where it's presidential, but there is also a prime minister in that case. In which case they do sort of divide out the reign versus the rule. The president can sometimes, or the prime minister, depending on what one we're talking about and how it works in a semi-presidential system. One takes primarily the job as head of state, another takes the job primarily of head of government. So Claire, let me know if that helps. If it doesn't, I'll try to fix it for you. All right, and just a heads up, guys, remember, if you don't ask questions, I won't do this. Yeah. We've got another hour on the clock. As soon as you guys run out of questions or we run out of time, we will stop. Okay, sound good? All right. Kat says, what policies or acts do we need to know when it comes to Charles, Cromwell, Charles II, and James II? Okay. In terms of questions about the political history of Britain, you do need to know some big ideas here. I would say that the big thing you need to know with regards to Charles I, Cromwell, Charles II, and James II are really two major concepts. The first is that you need to look at the idea of the English Civil War as being an expression of kind of the supremacy of Parliament over the crown. That was at heart really the big argument in the English Civil War, was about whether or not the crown had the right to tax without permission of Parliament. And that was what Charles I was trying to do. And according to the Magna Carta, no, you can't do that. So there's that. The other big issue that I would bring up with regards to the English Civil War is that basically do their political revolutionizing stuff at the end of the 1600s, which means that while the rest of the world is this question of how do we deal with absolute monarchism and the ideals of the Enlightenment, like Britain is already set when the Enlightenment starts to occur. And that means that it's a relatively stable place, okay, with a few exceptions. The other thing I would bring up with regards to James II, the big thing that I would know with the Glorious Revolution. And what that does essentially in terms of requiring William and Mary to sign the Bill of Rights, which means that essentially it legally establishes the idea of a constitutional monarchy. I had a bit of a blackout there on my screen there. Anybody want to tell me, could you still hear me okay? Let's see here. Okay. All right. So far, I'm not seeing that anything happened there, but screen went black for me for a moment. So if anything happens, guys, just let me know and I'll get to you. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Yeah, Kat, I hope that helps. If not, let me know. Neelan wants me to go over devolution and hung parliament and the major points within those readings. Okay, I can tell you a little bit about devolution and the hung parliament. I'll leave the readings to you guys. You have access to them. Y'all do it, okay? Um, with regards to devolution, the big ideas that you need to know here is that this is an attempt to establish regional control in a way that just didn't exist. And part of this is out of a feeling of essentially dominated by English politics rather than national politics, that the Parliament in London was essentially the English Parliament, which meant that Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland didn't have a lot of local regional control. So starting in the late 90s, what you see is a push primarily from the Labour Party, which has strongholds in all of those areas, particularly in Scotland, pushing for some degree of regional control. So as a result of this, in 1997, both Wales and Scotland wind up with their own regional parliaments. And what that means is that issues of local monies and taxation are basically handled by the Scottish Parliament or by the Welsh Parliament or by the Northern Irish Assembly. They do have significant powers. The Welsh Parliament is less powerful than the Scottish Parliament. Only Scots can vote in Scottish parliamentary elections. Only the Welsh can vote in Welsh parliamentary elections, et cetera, et cetera. And what this means is that there is some degree of power given to those regional bodies from the central unitary government. But even though there are parliaments in Scotland and in Wales and a National Assembly in Northern Ireland, it is absolutely critical to remember that the UK remains a unitary state. And that's because there is no legal protection or prohibition against removing those parliaments. There is no specified reservation of powers for regional governments or for local governments. That's what makes it a unitary state. Our system is a federal system because it specifically says in the Constitution that any powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the state or the individual. And that is not the case in the UK. So power is centralized and only gives away power when necessary. And remember, I talked about how in 1986, Margaret Thatcher was able to dissolve the Greater London Council. That is an example of the power of the unitary state, where the central government can basically take away a local form of representation. So that's a big idea with regards to devolution. The next thing, the hung parliament of 2010, the last time it had happened was 1974. I think, yeah, 1974. And a hung parliament is what occurs when no one major party reaches a majority of seats. So that means in the UK that you need at least 326 members of parliament from one party in order to claim a majority. Now, if you wind up with 321, or however many it was that the Conservatives actually wound up with, and I can't remember off the top of my head, that means you don't have a majority. That means on every single piece of legislation you propose, you are going to have to fight to find the votes. That makes things difficult. It slows down the parliamentary process. And while that's kind of the way we're used to seeing things here in the United States, that sort of grinding vote by vote process, that's very different from the way that the parliamentary process traditionally works in the UK. So what that means is that traditionally in the UK, if your party doesn't win 326 votes, then what you do is you form a coalition government. Now, a coalition government, sorry, I'm trying to Stretch. Okay. A coalition government basically means that what you do is you find another minor party who has similar ideas to you, who will, in exchange for some power in the cabinet and potentially some other concessions, they will join you and vote with you on all issues. This means that you exert really strong party discipline. That basically, if you don't vote with the party on these issues, you lose power. Possibly you lose your seat, you don't get to stand for re-election, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea was in 2010, the Conservatives won the most seats, but they didn't have a clear majority. So they formed a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats under the leadership of Nick Clegg. The Lib Dems are a centrist left party, way more centrist than, say, Labour. Labour's pretty dang social democratic. And they have some policies in common with the Conservatives. So in exchange for positions within the cabinet that the Lib Dems got, as well as a promise from the Prime Minister David Cameron that there would be a referendum held on the possibility of adopting an alternative voting system, the Liberal Democrats basically form a coalition government with the Conservatives. Now, you also have the possibility, if your party doesn't reach 326 in terms of member of parliament, you can also choose to make it so that you can form a minority government where you just don't bother to form a coalition with anybody, and then you fight for every individual vote, which is kind of how we do things here. But that's really not how the British traditionally understand their parliamentary procedure, and it made things very difficult for them. So that's not the ideal way to go. Very few people do that. The other option is, if you can't come to an agreement to form a coalition government or to form a minority government, then you have to dissolve the entire parliament that's just been elected, hold new national elections, and do the whole dang thing over again, which nobody wants. So coalition government it was. Yeah, that's basically the stuff that you need to know for those. Okay. What are the major documents that make up common law? Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, signed after the Glorious Revolution. That's a big one. Let's see here. The Act of Supremacy under Henry VIII is a big deal because it establishes a separation from the Roman Catholic Church. Trying to think of other big ones that you should know. Really, frankly, Bill of Rights, Magna Carta, you hit those, you're fine. Okay. Sarah Baker wants to know, okay, no, we already did that one. Hi, Kiara. It says, it's Kiara. Can we please go over the representation of the House of Commons and how the 650 people are elected? I actually talked about this earlier in the study session, but really, really quickly, you've got 650 people. Each of them represent a constituency of about 68,000 people. It could be more, it could be less, and they're probably going to work on some redistricting by about 2018. So that's coming up. But basically, they're elected on SMD system, a single member districting system, and each person in parliament gets one vote, and they're supposed to represent their local constituency. Kiara, this was actually one of the very first things I talked about. So if you like, go back and watch like the first 5-10 minutes of this video, and the answer's in there. So let me know if you got other questions on it, okay? Because I want to keep moving on. Let's see, do I have any other things coming in through Twitter? No, okay. All right. Well, I don't think so. Hey, let me double check. Okay, nothing else on Twitter. Sorry. All right. Okay, other questions here. Neelan wants to know, what are the major differences between the multiple institutions within the EU? Okay, so there are a lot of different institutions within the EU, okay? But let's start with like the basic ones involved in legislative bodies. So the first and most important one is probably the European Parliament. The European Parliament is directly elected by EU member states, rather the citizens of EU member states. So there are 28 members of the EU, and that does include the UK. Excuse me, that's really gross, because the UK is still a member state of the EU until they activate Article 50, which they haven't yet. So basically, what you've got is the European Parliament. European Parliament has 750 members, so more even than the House of Commons. And of those 750 members, they basically use a PRSMD system. So what that means is that they make sure that every member state has at least a certain number, and I'm not sure what the base number is. We can look it up though. They have a certain number of representatives from every member state. So like Liechtenstein, which has like 4 people, still has representatives under SMD. They're represented in the European Parliament. And then there are proportional representation that goes to the population of each member state. So that, say, like Germany, which is the most popular of the EU member states, has more representatives than does, like, Luxembourg, which has maybe 7 people. So the idea here is that, yes, Luxembourg and tiny little Liechtenstein are represented, but the reality of it is that they have less of an impact on the vote than do, say, Germany and France. So you do have representation regardless of your size, but that size, that influence is tempered, okay? So it's basically like the idea of combining the House of Representatives with the Senate into one legislative body. So everybody has equal representation, and then everybody has proportional representation. So that's how that goes. They are directly representative. People have political parties associated with them. So like your EU parliamentary representative might potentially be from the Green Party or whatever. So they're sort of like overarching European political parties that are developing, which is really fascinating. So there's that. And then there is the European Council, which is made up of the heads of state / heads of government of all member states. So if you are the head of state or the head of government, whoever's more powerful in your country, then you sit on the European Council by default. So like Theresa May doesn't run for European Council, but she is part of it because she is the leader of the UK, and therefore she sits on the European Council. Then you have the Council as a whole, is basically selected by the governments of EU member states. And the council as a whole is like whatever the government in your country is, you get X number of seats on this council. That's based on proportional representation based on the size of your contributions and also your population to the EU. So basically, like the UK gets to put certain members of their government on the council. Then you have something called the Commission. The Commission is basically voted on by the European Council. That's the heads of states, heads of government, and they get to choose who they want to be on the Commission. The Commission essentially acts as executives of the European Union. The Commission has a president that they elect from within their body, and they're technically the president of the EU. But that presidential position rotates just to make things even more complicated. Now, in terms of legislation, basically the way it works is that the commission says, hey, wouldn't it be awesome if we dealt with this issue? And then they throw it down to the individual member states, say, go back to your home countries, tell me if you have some ideas on how to do this, and then bring us ideas back. Those people come back from their home countries, go to the European Parliament, sit down in committees and try to hash out some legislation, and then the European Parliament proposes legislation. That legislation then is checked by the Commission to make sure that it actually adheres with existing EU law, because it's complicated. The Commission will say, yeah, it sounds good, let's push it on out. Otherwise, they'll say, no, actually, you can't do this because like European Union Clause 27 says you can't, and then go back and fix it. If the Commission says everything's in order, then it goes from the European Council, which directly represents the governments of the member states, not the citizens of the member states, which are different. And then you have the fights over whether or not each side likes it, and they can amend each version of the legislation that comes up, and they can send it back to the fits regulations, and it's a pain in the butt. So that's basically sort of how the EU works. It has 3 major types of laws that it can pass. It can pass regulations, which affect all of its member states and take supremacy over um, over national law. It's like the supremacy clause in the United States Constitution. If the EU passes a regulation, then all member states have to follow it. Regulations are binding; they affect everybody equally. Then there's something called a directive, which gives you a little bit more local freedom. So a directive is where the EU says, like, here's the directive. We want to lower carbon emissions by 3% in the next 5 years. And then that's the directive. Now you take that back to your member state, your home country, and you guys figure out what laws you need to pass on a national level to be in compliance. You have to be in compliance. You have to meet the directive, but how you do it is up to you. So that's a little bit more flexible. And then you have opinions and resolutions. And opinions, so resolutions? Yeah, opinions and resolutions. And opinions and resolutions are just sort of like just non-binding statements. A resolution or an opinion could be something like, it would be very nice if all girls got the same quality as education as boys. There's nothing binding about that. There's no law associated with it. There's no policy associated with it. There's no taxation, nothing like that. So an opinion or a resolution is kind of just a statement. So that's not really that big of a deal. I hope that helped, Neelan. If it didn't, let me know. The EU is super, super confusing. But if you're, I can't remember, Neelan, if you're in A Day or B Day. If you're in B Day, we're going to watch a video on tomorrow to talk a little bit about the EU some more. But it's, yeah, the EU is super, super confusing. Okay. Kat, what are the differences between the European Economic Area, Schengen area, and the Eurozone? Okay. So basically, here's how it works. You have the European Union, which is 28 member states, and there are all sorts of laws and treaties that involve the EU. There's the European Economic Area, which is basically all of the EU member states plus, I think, 3 others. And that includes Norway and a couple of others that I can't remember, but Norway is the big one. Iceland is another. Norway and Iceland, and there's another. They're not member states of the EU. But what it does is it means that they're subjected to basically all of the regulations and requirements of the EU, including dues payments, with a few exceptions with regards to certain laws regarding fishing primarily. But the economic area is basically, that's where the EU came from, was the European Economic Area. It was this agreement to kind of like lessen trade barriers to encourage cross-border communication and a lot of free movement of goods and ideas, which gave rise to the idea of the Schengen area. So the Schengen area, it's singular, it's not plural, so Schengen area. The Schengen area is, in essence, what it is a place where basically it means that you don't have to have a passport to travel from one country to another. Once you gain entrance to countries that have signed on to the Schengen area agreement, then you are good to travel from that country to any other country that also holds the Schengen area agreement. So that means that, like, Spain is part of the Schengen area, so is France, so is Germany, so is. So that means that if you, after graduating this year, you decide to go to, like, France, you can hop on the Eurostar, which is their super awesome train system, and travel all throughout the Schengen area without needing a passport. You should have one anyway because you have to get back into the US, but you don't need one. You won't have to show papers crossing borders. And the idea is that this allows people to move freely, not just for travel and, like, vacation purposes, but also for business. It means that you can have people who are from Poland, which is part of the Schengen area, live and work in London, which is something that the British have strong feelings about. Well, the London thing is complicated because the UK is actually not part of the Schengen area, so forget I said that. But there are still reasons why they have to allow them in, but it's complicated. But regardless, so the Schengen area is basically free borders, okay? And the Eurozone is basically anybody who uses the euro. And I think there are like 26 countries that use the euro. The UK, again, is not one of them. However, as of some modifications to the EU's charter, as of, I think, 2009, any new countries that join the EU have to join both the Schengen area and the Eurozone from here on out. Okay. Okay. Let's see here. Can I explain Quangos, Sinn Féin, and Plaid Cymru? Okay. All right. So let's see here. Okay, I can do that. And I think, Alex, you might be my last question. So if I don't have any further questions after I answer Alex's question, then we're done, guys, and I'm going to hang up. So I still see that there are 14 of you guys watching. So let me know if you've got any further questions, because otherwise I got stuff to do. Okay, so let's see here. Let's start off with Quangos. Quango, first of all, is a super awesome word, and I love it. Quango stands for quasi-autonomous, okay, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental, that doesn't work, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organization. I don't know why I'm adding like fingers for extra syllables here. I'm tired. But basically, Quangos are something that were really encouraged, especially under Margaret Thatcher, because what they are is that they are not officially part of the government. Okay, they are non-governmental organizations. If you are familiar with Model UN at all, you are familiar with NGOs, but NGOs are organizations that operate outside of the government to provide sometimes governmental-like services. Quangos are quasi-autonomous because they do receive some degree of public funding. So, for example, there are a lot of organizations within the United States which would potentially be considered a Quango, like the Federal Reserve. You could consider that to a certain degree to be a Quango because the Federal Reserve is separate from much of the rest of the federal government, yet it provides governmental services and is partially publicly funded, or mostly publicly funded in our case. But the idea behind Quangos under Margaret Thatcher's economic reforms was that the government, the size of the government, could be shrunk by delegating some governmental duties to Quangos. They've been highly criticized, however, because whenever you've got the government kind of partially involved in something but not fully involved in something, means that there are a lot of overlaps and layers of bureaucratic red tape. So Quangos are often understood to be incredibly bureaucratic. So there, a lot of criticism of this is that even though Thatcher and her Conservative government were really trying to seek to shrink the size of the overall government of the UK, what they did was they added layers of complexity to it. It's a legitimate concern, but it is, however, also a really interesting idea to sort of like subcontract the idea of government out to somebody else. Okay. Sinn Féin and Plaid Cymru, not Plaid, I can't talk, Plaid Cymru. I know it looks like Plaid, but it's not said that way. Sinn Féin is a Northern Irish separatist group. It is the political wing of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which is often understood to be a terrorist organization. They've done some not so nice things, but Sinn Féin is its political wing. Officially, they decry any use of violence. You can take that with a grain of salt. However, they are regionally important as a political entity, particularly in the Northern Irish Assembly. Their big push is for Northern Ireland to withdraw from the European Union to become part of the Republic of Ireland and reunify the entirety of Ireland, the island itself. They are predominantly Catholic. A lot of their narrative stems from the idea of English colonialism in Ireland, resentment for English economic and educational policy, which has been really, historically not so great for Northern Ireland, especially if you're Catholic. So Sinn Féin persists in representing the separatist movement within the Northern Irish Assembly. However, when they're elected to national parliament in London, which they are because of their constituency blocks, there's about 4 seats that they regularly hold. They refuse to send any parliamentary representatives. No MPs go stand in London um, for Sinn Féin because they are in principle objecting to the idea of British control over Ireland. So that's Sinn Féin. Plaid Cymru pushes for Welsh independence. It is another nationalist group. They also emphasize the importance of maintaining Welsh culture and language, really seeking to preserve that. Okay, let's see here. Okay, next question. Can I explain the third way, the difference between collectivist consensus and collective responsibility? Okay, those are good things to ask, especially since a lot of you guys screwed up on collectivist consensus and collective responsibility on your vocabulary quiz. Hang on a second, I'm kind of thirsty. Okay. So let's see here. The third way, we'll start at the beginning here. The third way is associated particularly with Blair, Tony Blair in 1997, when his Labour government came to power. He argued that this was going to be the new Labour, and he used that phrase a lot. This is new Labour. This isn't old school Marxist, far British leftist Labour politics. No, what we're trying to do is walk a line in between Thatcher's conservatism with the traditional goals about equality and social democracy of say, the traditional Labour Party. So Blair is very much he adopts a lot of neoliberal policies, particularly with regards to economics and free trade. In a lot of ways, he was actually very similar as a politician to Bill Clinton. Clinton representing sort of a pretty center-right Democrat in terms of his economic policies, if you think about NAFTA and things like that. So Blair is kind of a little bit more economically classically liberal than, say, most Labour Party politicians previously had been. So he was kind of seeking to bridge that divide. He continued a lot of Thatcher's policies with softened edges to it. So had a lot more sympathy for Labour unions, but also encouraged the preservation of things like, slightly lighter taxes, less government intrusion, that sort of stuff, shrinking the size of the government overall. That's the idea of the third way. The idea is that it's not traditional conservatism and it's not hardcore Labour politics. It is instead a third way. That's where that phrase is coming from. Okay. In fact, actually, eventually what's going to happen is Labour kind of is going to reconsolidate around traditional Labour ideologies. And that third way part, that new Labour core, breaks off and becomes the Liberal Democrats. That's kind of where they come from. And then you have the idea of collectivist consensus that you wanted clarification on. Okay, collectivist consensus is what we refer to the period after 1945 to about 1974, wherein regardless of who was in charge, either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, they both tended to emphasize social welfare programs like the NHS, like increased funding for things like health and education services, a lot of money and allocation of resources to infrastructure rebuilding. The idea being that it was important for the government to take an active role in people's daily lives following the war. That breaks down after the economic downturn of the early 70s, when we wind up with kind of like the Great Malaise here in the US and stagnation in the UK. That breaks down and gives rise to more conservative, liberal economic policies coming out of the Conservative Party. Okay, so that's the collectivist consensus. Collective responsibility is a traditional policy that applies to the cabinet within, and that's, I knew I forgot one of the political institutions there. The cabinet. Okay, so the cabinet is a part of the executive branch of government within the UK, just like it is here in the United States. The cabinet is basically appointed by not just the parliament, not just the prime minister, but the ruling party. And almost inevitably, the cabinet comes just from that ruling party. Now, that doesn't always happen in the president's cabinet in the United States. Frequently, you get cross-party representatives there. But that almost never happens unless you have a coalition government in the UK. So the cabinet basically is meant to speak with one voice, that you've got one policy coming from the cabinet. Collective responsibility is the idea that the cabinet should not be divided on particular issues, that everybody should agree to policy, and if they don't agree to policy, then they have an obligation to leave the parliament. That's actually kind of up for debate right now. Brexit has proven so divisive an issue. That several members of the cabinet say that they cannot support the idea of Brexit. They really don't want to see Article 50 executed, and they're not shy about saying so, particularly I think the finance minister. However, they refuse to leave the cabinet because they feel it's important for them to be present. And to provide some form of stability. So Theresa May has actually talked about kind of suspending on this one particular issue the idea of collective responsibility because it is so important. But we'll see how that turns out. But the idea traditionally with collective responsibility is that you have this ability to, the idea is that everybody in government, everybody in the halls of the cabinet are on the same page with regards to this. Okay, so I hope that helps. Selena wants me to talk about the Norman invasion, and then I see no further questions. For real, guys? I could stop talking early. Okay. The Norman invasion. Norman invasion happened in 1066, and basically what you've got is prior to 1066, England and Wales and a whole bunch of, even wasn't England at the time. It was, you had the beginnings of England, and then you had places like Mercia and Albion and all sorts of different places. Regardless, you had a major English king whose name was Edward the Confessor. He dies. And when he died, the Anglos and Saxons, they had the Angles, not Anglos. Dumb. The Angles and Saxons had interesting policies with regards to kingship. They didn't use the feudal system. They actually elected their kings. Now, generally speaking, it was still a rule of primogeniture where it passed down through family lines to the eldest sons, but it didn't have to. So you had these tribal chieftains who would vote on who they wanted to be king. And they voted ultimately after the death of Edward and decided they wanted this dude, Harold Godwinson, to be their next king. Yay, Harold. However, across the English Channel, there was a duke by the name of William from Normandy, thus William of Normandy, and he was a cousin of Edward the Confessor. Now, according to French traditions of governance, they do use primogeniture, and feudalism is much stronger in the French territories at that time as of 1066. So Edward feels that he has a claim on the crown of England. And so he rouses something like 6,000 men. He has, or at least 6,000 in his cavalry, and takes them across the English Channel, which, take a moment and imagine getting 6,000 horses onto ships and crossing very, 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 very choppy waters. Please imagine, if you will, seasick horses, because it can't have been fun. So he finally gets over to England. He has a cavalry. His knights are in full plate armor, which is very, very different from the way that the Anglos and Saxons fight. Angles and Saxons, wow. How they fight. Ultimately, Harold Godwinson is killed, and William takes the throne. And what this does is it unites sort of the Normans from Western Europe, who are, they are a combination of Vikings and Germanic Frankish groups kind of over there, who speak a Latinized language. They're coming out of sort of the stronger area of influence of Rome. And they're bringing over Charlemagne's sort of ideas about feudalism with them, in addition to, you know, this invading force. So what's going to happen is you're going to see the development of feudalism in the Great Britain as a result of this, as well as sort of a privileging of the Norman upper classes over, say, the Anglo and Saxon, and also the Jutes and other people of Germanic origin and also Celtic origin within the British Isles. And that's why you have like the Celtic fringe persist in some places and not in others. The Celtic fringe is primarily going to be way up in the north of Scotland, way to the west in Wales and the West Country, as well as in Ireland. And those are areas that the Normans didn't take initially. So that's why you see the persistence of the Celtic fringe. Okay, let's see here. Can we please go? Oh, now the questions come rolling in. I knew it. I knew you guys had other things. All right, Allison, I think you must have joined us late because I've already talked about the Golden Dawn. But the Golden Dawn is a neo-fascist group with political representation in the Greek Parliament. If you go back probably first half hour, 45 minutes of this video, I talk a little bit about fascism, and you should be able to hear me talk about it there. Okay. Neoliberalism as an economic policy is basically a return after sort of the social democratic policies with regards to economics, what we would consider socialism. A kind of a return to classical liberalism, the idea of emphasizing the individual over the idea of equality of opportunity. That's neoliberal policy. It really emphasizes free trade in a globalized world. That's the big difference between classical liberalism and neoliberalism, is the existence of globalization. That's the big difference there. Alex wants to know if I can briefly go over the roles of Charles I, Cromwell, Charles II, and James II, and Walpole. Okay, Alex, I've actually already talked a little bit about Charles I, Cromwell, and Charles II, and James II, but really quickly, Charles I is basically the reason why the English Civil War happens. He inherited a pretty bad fiscal situation. As a result of this, he also really was an absolutist, didn't think that Parliament had the right to limit his power. Parliament, of course, disagreed. Thus, there was a war. Charles got his head chopped off. Okay. Cromwell takes over after the death of Charles I. He is the leader of the parliamentary forces, the new model army. He is a Puritan, so he has loads of fun. Everybody loves Cromwell, right? Cromwell is definitely in favor of the power of Parliament, but he's also a military dictator, so that doesn't last very long. Cromwell rules for 11 years, dies, his son briefly takes over, nobody cares, and they restore the monarchy under Charles II. Charles II plays better with Parliament because he's learned his lesson. He saw his dad get his head chopped off. Charles II, however, dies without a legitimate heir. He has lots of kids, but none by the Queen, so that's a problem. As a result of that, his brother, James II, takes the throne. James II is a Catholic, or real close to a Catholic, or we're not sure, but his wife is definitely a Catholic, and the possibility is that his new wife, who is definitely a Catholic, is pregnant with a kid, and if that kid's a boy, then we've got a problem. Because remember, the crown can't go to a Catholic in the British system. That's part of the rules. So James II is going to be essentially encouraged to leave by Parliament, and his daughter Mary and her husband William will be made the new monarchs of England. And that right there requires the signing of the Bill of Rights, which essentially establishes the UK as a parliamentary democracy, a constitutional monarchy. It's a big deal. So Bill of Rights, super important. Pay attention to it. Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Tiara, for helping. Aw. Thank you very much for helping that. Okay, let's see here. Allison wants to know, who is Adam Smith? Adam Smith, father of capitalism, in terms of sort of the general ideas here. I'm going to tell Dr. Roach you didn't know who Adam Smith was, Allison. She's not going to be happy with you. Okay, all right. So Adam Smith writes this book in 1776. What a coincidence. Called The Wealth of Nations, in which he's basically talking about the ideas of mercantile capitalism. Basically, he thinks that the ideas of capitalism is that you've got this idea of the invisible hand. You should remember this. I know you've read it recently. If you haven't, you have a quiz coming up for macro, so you better study. But the ideas behind the invisible hand is that if government and policy gets out of business, then people will make rational decisions, and the market will balance itself out based off of those rational decisions. If the government gets too involved in things, then it artificially lowers or encourages particular behaviors. So Smith talks about the invisible hand of the market. Okay. Okay. All right. Neelan wants to know, what makes a liberal democracy liberal? Oh, that's such a good question. I like it. That could be a good short answer question. Okay. Let's see here. What makes a liberal democracy liberal? Okay. Well, when we talk about a liberal democracy, there are certain characteristics that we're assuming, and those assumptions don't really have to do with voting, because a democracy presumes voting. Illiberal democracies, also known as hybrid regimes, we've got to keep using that term so you don't forget it, but illiberal democracies are sometimes called hybrid regimes. Okay. Democracy is usually identified as the basic premises that people make choices, right? That's the basic idea behind a democracy. But an illiberal democracy is one where the choices are made, but perhaps the results don't matter, or the choices are made, but there aren't many choices. So in a liberal democracy, what matters is not just that people vote, but that the voting matters and influences the direction of government and policy, as well as the fact that people participate in a political manner in more than just voting. There's an active civil society. Usually and that usually means that there's freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And those are big ideas. So really, when we talk about a liberal democracy, what we're often talking about is the idea of constitutional liberalism, where there are certain rights and privileges of groups and individuals that are preserved by law, and that is really what the hallmark of a liberal democracy is. An illiberal democracy, people have voices, but those voices may or may not actually influence policy. So those are the big things to consider there. I would really go back and reread Fareed Zakaria's Illiberal Democracy. That's like the third time I've said it during this session, so you can kind of assume I'm going to ask you a lot about it. Yeah? Okay. All right. Tira asked kind of a follow-up on the same question. What is the difference between an indirect and direct democracy and a liberal and an illiberal democracy? Well, I kind of just went over liberal and illiberal. So Tira, unless there's a follow-up question with regards to liberal versus illiberal, I'm just going to focus on direct versus indirect. Okay, direct versus indirect democracies could be either liberal or illiberal. It doesn't particularly matter. What matters there is the method of voter participation. Okay, a direct democracy really on a historical scale hasn't happened in a long time. A direct democracy is where every individual who is a citizen of that nation votes on every issue. That is direct democracy. You can have expressions of direct democracy in most modern democratic systems, like the referendum for Brexit is an expression of direct democracy. When people go to the polls on November 8th here in Georgia, there are going to be 4 ballot measures, which if you're voting, you should know those ballot measures. Make sure you do some research. WABDE has been doing some really good background information on those 4 ballot measures, so make sure you don't go in blind. That's my PSA. Regardless, okay, so Georgia has 4 ballot measures on the ballot this year in terms of constitutional amendments. People voting on those, that is direct democracy. That is, here is this issue, what do you personally think about it? And if you think about it, like, that is truly, truly democratic, like that direct voting on individual issues. However, in a modern sense, it is impractical, right? You can't vote on everything. If we voted on everything, like if we had some sort of method by which we all like had a vote that went directly to our phones, and every time there was an issue, we'd get a buzz on the phone would never stop buzzing, right? If we voted on everything. So a direct democracy is every citizen votes on every issue. That's a direct democracy. An indirect democracy is way more common, and this is really what most democratic systems do, and that is where you elect people to make decisions on your behalf with regards to certain issues. So it's representative democracy. Representative democracy is more commonly understood as republicanism, but it is still democratic. Okay? So there you go. I hope that helps. Any further questions? I'm not seeing any. I'll wait another minute and see if anybody else has any questions. And if not, then I'm going to sign off, okay? Do, 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 do. Okay, all right. Tara has a follow-up. Good to see. Okay. Direct versus indirect pertains to voting participation. Liberal versus illiberal pertains to written law, just to clarify. Not necessarily written law, because like the UK is a liberal democracy, but they have unwritten constitutional law. Illiberal means more to the effect that people may vote, but that voting may not matter. People may participate, but that participation may not matter. Okay? Or that your choices are so limited that it really doesn't have a lot to do with it. There's actually, I'll tell you what, I may put it up on the blog if I can think about it, but there's a good crash course video, like Crash Course World History. I think it's the last one in series 2. It's on authoritarian democracy, which is essentially illiberal democracy. I'm going to be showing it when we do our unit on China because it specifically refers to China, but it is still pertinent here if you want to go look at it on YouTube and see if you can find it for you. So Kiara follows up and says, so if a country isn't a direct democracy in all aspects, does it automatically make it an indirect democracy? Kiara, I would make the argument that all democratic governments today, by matters of scale, simply have to be indirect democracies. But there are expressions of direct democracy within that, okay, where we vote directly on particular issues. That happens primarily more at a local and regional level than it does at a state level. But yeah, I would make the argument that most modern states operate on the assumption of it being an indirect democracy rather than a direct democracy. Okay. Anything else? Okay. I'm glad that helped. All right, guys. Well, we'll stop a little bit early if nobody else has any questions, okay? I'll give it a moment. Let me see how the delay is doing here, if anybody has any questions. Yeah, Sarah, sure. Go ahead. Bring food tomorrow for first period. That's cool. Yeah. I mean, we still have work we've got to do, but yeah, bring food. That's cool. Okay. All right, guys, I'll go ahead and sign off then. Oh, hang on. Oh, Allison, trying to get under the wire here. Have I already talked about how to check the power of the majority outside of the United States? Okay. Like, are you talking about the idea of the tyranny of majority? I think that's probably where you're going with it here. The tyranny of the majority is a big question, especially with regards to things when we think about voting systems. And the big issue with regards to the idea of the tyranny of the majority is like SMD systems, single member district systems, especially if you have a multi-party system. Like if you have a ton of different little tiny parties, then having a single member district really makes things quite difficult. So a lot of places, particularly like Australia, New Zealand, I'm trying to think who else, have moved to mixed electoral systems whereby you have both single member districts, so you've got a representative for a small regional area, but you also have the possibility of proportional representation, which means that you take into consideration the number of people who voted for particular parties as well. If you remember, we watched that CPG Gray video on the alternative voting system. That's a really good kind of rundown on how things work. But that's one way that people are working to try and check the power of the majority, especially outside of the United States. In the US, it would take an awful lot of electoral reform because everything's based on a state-by-state basis. So I hope that helps. Yeah? Ah, okay. All right, since I think that sounds like okay, good. All right, since I think that sounds like it's pretty much everybody's questions, I will leave you, ladies. I think it's mostly girls. I have not seen any guys, so this means I should do a gender breakdown on my data for the next test and just see how it turns out. Interesting. Okay. But I will see you guys tomorrow or Tuesday, depending on what class you have for me. Don't forget, you do have current events coming up on the 1st or the 2nd, depending on what class you are. The current event information is up on the blog. You can go ahead and submit that. I've seen that some of you already have, which is really useful. Also, if you're in Model UN and going to the GSU conference, you owe me position papers. I'm hitting send on them tonight by 10 p.m. Get them to me. Bye.